I'm just going to run through a few quick slides to talk about our industry and my association, our association, I should say. And I may flip through a few. I have a few extras just to keep us on time. So about FERPA, as Derek said, we're a provincial organization established in 1985. We represent owners and managers across the province, from small mom and pops up to the large corporate owners in all areas of the province. What do we do? A raison d'etre of our organization is government relations. You people deal with, market risk, financing risk, cost risk, and FERPO represents the whole area of political risk, which is a big challenge for our industry. We're a heavily regulated industry. We do public relations as well. We have a certification program, a certified rental building program. We have education seminars, legal advice, take on legal challenges. We provide networking opportunities and a variety of information. Derek mentioned about things we've done. It's for some of you might not be familiar with our organization. This is a different crowd, and for those of you who aren't familiar with some of our achievements, we brought vacancy decontrol to the province from a strict rent control environment that allows market rent setting on vacant units. FERPO also got an exemption for newly constructed rental units from rent control. That was something that we brought in 1998, which is an important topic for this session, I think. We got a new rental property tax class and a single family rate for rental registered condos as well in 1998. And most major urban centers have this new rental class, allowing you to get the single family rate. Without it, a lot of the new rental we have seen, what little there has been, would not have been feasible. We got an equalization of provincial property taxes as well back in the late 1980s. And a set of rules that has set up a slow process of property tax equalization taking place across the province in major centers. And I'll show you some slides about the progress we've made on that front. We won a big battle to use income criteria in the tenant selection process that we spent quite a bit, had to raise about $1.5 million as an association to fight the legal challenges. We also saved vacancy decontrol after bringing it in. I'll speak to that in a bit, and brought in some suite metering rules, and we regularly advocate for housing allowances to help people with affordability needs. So just about saving vacancy decontrol, just to give you an example of one of the challenges we face, we're in a very politicized environment, as Derek has said. When McGuinty was elected, he had made a number of key promises, and right off the bat, he ended up having to break a whole bunch of them, which is including no tax increases and balancing the budget right away, and no health delisting, and rolling back the tolls in 407. So he was under all these taxes being a promise breaker. But one of his promises was also to bring back real rent control. So we as an industry, our challenge was to convince the elected premier to break yet another of his promises to not turn the clock back in our industry back to the bad days of rent control. So that's just an example of one of our achievements. I talked about the property taxes. You can see some of the progress we've made on property tax rates. That's the Toronto multi-res ratio. That's the ratio of multi-residential property taxes to single-family property taxes. We've made some significant progress over that time because of some provincial rules that we've put in place. There's a snapshot of what's happened in Waterloo region as well. You see the same sort of progress. Here's some other sort of a snapshot of the centers in the last few years. The general trend has been a movement down in the multi-residential ratio, which is good for owners of the existing stock. I'll talk a bit about some of our challenges, but I thought while I had a bit of time, one of the things FERPO does is collect and gather information. I just want to tell you a bit about our industry and reflect some of the questions I commonly get. For example, how many rental households are there in Ontario? Where do they live? This is a snapshot from the census. This is census data. It's the only source where somebody goes around all the buildings and asks people whether they're renting or owning. And you can see that it's quite dominated by the high-rise and the low-rise, but as Derek had mentioned earlier, there's a significant amount of supply that comes from non-traditional sources, from the single-family households, semis and duplexes. And I broke out the condos. People talk about condos a lot. As a percentage of the stock right now, it's quite low, but as a percentage of new supply, it's quite high, and I'll show you some of that data in a bit. So the stock has been aging. This is a graph that shows you more census data about how the the age of the rental stock has been varying. Basically, every 5 years that pass, the average age of a rental building ages 4 years because we're not adding much new supply. So it's relevant in the context of this symposium that you're having, that you have a constantly aging product with not much new that's being offered to the marketplace that presents an opportunity going forward. This is from the census tenants' perceptions of the rental buildings, and the older they get, the more that they are seen to be in need of major repair. Again, it speaks to the kind of opportunity that's developing out there. We have a very fast aging stock, and a stock that's in need of consistent upgrade, and a particular regulatory challenge in trying to upgrade the existing stock. We may have gotten vacancy decontrol, but we don't have the freedom you see in some of the other markets and what I see in the States to reposition buildings. If you were to try to take an old building and reposition it, all the existing tenants benefit from immediate increase in the value, and they might stay there. They're entitled to stay at their same rent for the rest of their life. We have lifetime rent controls. So again, that presents a challenge for those wanting to upgrade the existing stock and some opportunity for those looking for new construction. Just sort of a market snapshot of vacancy rates. I like looking at long time horizons to see what's happened in the market. You can see there's rather long cycles in the occupancy patterns in Ontario. This is just to give you a little snapshot. We sort of reached the tightest stage back in 2000, and the last bottom would have been like in 1889 when we had 0.1% vacancy rates in Toronto. So that gives you a sense of how the market has moved over time. This is rents, gives you another perspective on the cycle, and this has been a particular challenge here in this province. We had a sort of hot rental market in the latter 1990s, and after vacancy decontrol was brought in. But you see, we've been a rather long down cycle, a 10-year down cycle that is only starting to turn around. We're starting to see some of that in the market, and that will, looking at the length of the curve, that speaks to perhaps a nice upward trend in the next little while. Toronto, we have a longer data set for it, so this gives you we don't have this kind of data for Ontario. This is CMHC data. It puts the whole the rent levels. These are real rents, inflation-adjusted rents in a long-term cycle perspective. You can see how long the cycle has been rents for us. And the real issue for us, it speaks to regulation. We had the most brutal regulation we've ever had was the Davis government regulations brought in the 1970s, where we had a major decimation of the rental market. And the industry has been recovering since 1981. Basically, the long-term trend is we've been trying to recover from the devastation that was brought on our market since 1981. And you can see when vacancy decontrol was introduced, you see this spike in the latter 1990s, where we went up to a peak. And we've had this 10-year soft period of declining rents. But it's taken from basically where we are now, we've only just gotten back to the same rent levels we were in 1973. It's an interesting way to look at it. How do we fare compared to ownership market? It gives you a different perspective. It takes those price increases I show you, which look like they're significant. Compared to inflation, we really haven't been moving a lot in our industry, whereas home ownership costs have been going up quite significantly. Again, a significant advantage for our industry in making an offering. The ownership proposition is much more expensive, and that's been a major source of our competition with low interest rates. There's just another perspective on it. It shows you the change in carrying costs of owning versus renting. This is some CMH data, and it went from a differential of about $255 a month to $651 a month for a comparable product from 2008 to 2011. That's a pretty significant change. And even with slowing down we're seeing in the market, we still see prices rising in the ownership side. So it's a more challenge for them to be competitive to us. On the supply side, this gives you a perspective of where it comes from in the Toronto market. I compiled this based on changes over the past year. You can see the purpose-built rental is only about a third of the overall new supply. Most of the new supply in the rental market comes from condominiums, and that is really the major source of competition and supply in the marketplace now in Toronto. Maybe not the same story in other markets. That's more of a Toronto story. This gives you more of a provincial perspective on the history of starts and supply in Ontario. As you see, we used to have a rather active supply in the early 1970s, and those Davis-era rent controls that I talked about were quite devastating. You can see the impact they had on supply. We had a little bit of movement over the while. By the time we had the NDP legislative changes, which were in the early 1990s, rental supply almost disappeared, almost went to zero in the province because the rules and regulations were so bad. And we've recovered somewhere around 5,000 units a year in the province, again, which is not a lot when you think about the size of the population. And on the demographic side, I know you see lots of this data from other sources, so I'm going to go quickly through these slides. One big story is the rise of the one-person household in Ontario. This is, I think, probably happening right across North America. We have a shrinking household size. That means for the same amount of population, we need more units. So that's a very positive demand trend that's taking place. This one you've heard about as well. Boomerang kids is something you've heard about a lot. We've had a big change in the number of kids staying at home for a longer period. Between 1981 and 2001, you have practically a doubling in the number of kids that are doing that. But that's created what I see as a pent-up demand. These households are going to start to form in a while, and they're going to start moving these boom echo generation kids, which speaks to future opportunities. Tenants are also renting longer. If you look at some of the data that's out there, they're staying in their places longer, and turnover's declining a bit, which again speaks to another future and positive trend. Seniors, I know you hear about this all the time, and sometimes you have to take these long-term estimates with a grain of salt. But if there's any merit in the direction here, what this chart is telling you is that there's going to be a doubling in the household demand in the rental market, which is that brown segment, doubling in the population there. That's a lot of households that are going to be added over the next 30 years. So also speaks to some opportunity and possibly some tailor-made product for that, niche product for that market. This speaks to yesterday's seminar and another aspect of the whole supply equation in Ontario. This is a full-time university enrollment. I know there's been an explosion in enrollment going on, which is creating its own source of demand and actually creating some regulatory problems that our organization's having to look at. On the immigration side, it's been a little different for Ontario. We're down quite a bit from where we used to be because of the changing economic circumstances of the country. So that has definitely reduced the demand pressure we've been seeing in the province. We're almost at half of where we used to be in 2001 when the market was its hottest. So that's quite significant. And Toronto is impacted most by those immigration changes. Another impact has been the interprovincial migration. We've had a long segment of more people moving out of the province and moving into it. So we've had a lot of positive demand pressures developing, and because of the economy over the past while, some negative demand pressures. So those are just a few charts and backgrounds on the Ontario market I thought might be of some interest to you. In terms of the public policy issues which we focus on, people tend to approach me about those the most because they know that's what we're looking after on your behalf. Here's sort of a current list of issues, and I'll speak to some of them. The main one I'm not speaking to, but you all know about it. We have a minority government situation here in the province of Ontario, and those are the most dangerous for our industry. That's when we're most at risk, and when we're happiest is when we're not in the news, and when we're doing our job the best is when we're not getting into the news. So we've been spending all of our time and effort in the past while trying to keep our industry out of the news and not become a target in a budget negotiation. And I'm happy to say that as of now, we've been able to avoid getting caught in the crossfire at the moment, and other subjects are being brought forward in this minority government situation. But it's a very risky environment as long as it continues to be a minority government for us. So I'm going to speak to some of these other issues: the broken rent dispute process, the inadequate guideline, and the post-91 rent control exemption, and a few others. I think most of you, if you're in this business, you know about how bad the rent dispute process is in Ontario. We have the worst situation in the province. It's gotten better in some other provinces since I did this research. This shows you how long it takes to get rid of a troublesome or non-paying tenant. You're looking at least 90 days, 6 months if you've got a professional tenant. It's an issue that we're working hard on with the province to try and fix. This is just some of the things we've done. A little list for you. We've created a paper called Justice Denied. You can get it on our website. We've done a lot of public relations and media relations work and an MPP awareness campaign. And we've gotten coverage in the major newspapers who have begun to recognize that the system is very unfair to owners and investors. We do have rent controls here in Ontario, and the guideline continues to be a problem for us. It's CPI. It's going to be 0.9% in 2014. That's the forecast of FRPO. That's not a lot to cover your costs. It has not been adequate for people to cover costs in our business for the past few years. It's a significant problem. We used to have a much better guideline formula from the 85 to 2004 period, where we got half of an industry cost index plus 2%. So we did significantly better. So it's been a major challenge for people dealing with the existing rent control stock. An issue that's particularly important for this symposium is the whole issue of post-91 exemption for new construction. That's something that FRPO negotiated. It's one of those benefits I talked about earlier. We got an exemption from the Harris government in 1998. Anything built after 1991 is fully exempt from rent controls. Some of you may have noticed that this has become an issue. Derek mentioned in his opening speech this morning, in 1975, there was an exemption for new construction. It was called the post-75 exemption, and David Peterson's government took it away in 1985. And so we've had a much longer run with the post-91 exemption, but an NDP member is pushing this issue very hard. The City of Toronto is actually debating a resolution, I think today, to go forward to the province to propose eliminating this exemption. That would put a serious chill on the investment climate in this province if this was to happen. I'm happy to say in our discussions with the Minister's office, we've kept in touch with them. They're not hitting the panic button yet, but this is, in our industry, as many of you know, an issue like this can get away on us very, very quickly, and we're hoping this will go away. It's disappointing that City of Toronto is going to do this thing where they, recommend to the province that they do this. On the one hand, they say to us, we want you to build rental housing in the city. On the other hand, they propose regulations that would turn away the investment. So don't hit the panic button yet, but as you know, in this industry, there are constantly legislative risks. Another issue that's developing for us is the whole issue of licensing. And the interesting thing, and the reason I wanted to mention it here, is it has to do with this student housing explosion. The municipalities were given the power to license us in 2008. It's something we fought against, but the province wanted to do to give them a revenue tool. But where it's being driven is in all the university towns where students are moving out because there's so little purpose-built student rental housing. All the students are moving into the residential areas and changing the character of those neighborhoods. And it is creating pressure for these licensing regimes in all these municipalities. London, Waterloo, Oshawa, and North Bay, and Thorold have it already. And Hamilton, Guelph, Kitchener, and Kingston are looking at it, and it's all university related. I'm almost done there. So it speaks to the opportunity that there is to fill a need that all these towns see. I'm going to skip the Law Society. The other thing I thought I'd mention is the Access for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. FRPO's done a lot of work on this to avoid having there be any retroactive requirements for disabled access for the existing stock. But there will be some new requirements in new construction. I don't think they're going to be particularly onerous, but it's just something to be aware of, that there are rule changes coming when you are considering new construction. So those are just a few of the issues we're working on, and I thank you for your kind attention this afternoon.